On October 24, 1929, a day marked in history as Black Thursday, the world financial system collapsed in a matter of hours. In just 6 hours, $14,000 million evaporated, an amount greater than the total value of the Canadian economy at that time. 13 million shares were thrown into the void in a collective panic that no expert predicted. Telephone lines collapsed. Operators could not speak with the stock exchange, and, for a few moments, the heart of the financial system stopped beating. But behind this chaos, behind every scream, every lost order, and every fortune reduced to dust, there was a single decision. The decision of a man whose name seemed to have come out of a legend. Charles Mitchell, nicknamed by the press Charlie the Radiant, the country's most beloved banker, the guy everyone thought capable of stopping any crisis. And yet, what almost no one knew was that it was he who pulled the trigger of what we now call the Great Depression. 7 months before the disaster, Mitchell uttered a phrase intended to save the economy, a phrase designed to inspire confidence, to stop fear, to calm the markets. But that phrase, that single declaration, became the silent detonator of the most devastating collapse in modern history. And from that moment on, the world would never be the same. The Great Depression was not just an economic crisis. It was an open wound that forever marked an entire generation. It lasted 10 whole years and transformed every aspect of daily life. During this period, 25 million people lost their jobs. This means that 1 in 4 people was without the security of a salary and without a chance to support their families. 5,000 banks closed their doors forever, taking with them the savings of millions, of families who had worked for decades to save a few pennies that would give them peace. When these banks failed, the country's confidence failed along with them. People would wake up one day thinking they had a guaranteed future, and the next day they would discover that everything had evaporated. 2 million citizens were left without a roof over their heads. And can you imagine what that meant in a country that until recently considered itself the most prosperous on the planet? Families erected makeshift shelters with cardboard boxes and scraps of wood. Entire tent cities sprang up on the outskirts of major metropolises and bitterly called them Hoovervilles, a reminder of the president they blamed for the suffering. The emotional impact was also brutal. Suicides increased by 30%. Thousands of people could not bear the pressure of seeing their lives crumble without a clear way out. In a country that days before celebrated its wealth and growth, now mile-long lines of people formed, waiting for a piece of free bread to get through the day. The Great Depression was not just an economic fall, it was a spiritual and social breakdown that left deep scars on those who lived through it. And its origin, as you are discovering, goes back to very concrete decisions that chained together a human tragedy of immense proportions. But how did all this begin? To understand, you need to place yourself in the 1920s, a period known as the Crazy Years. It was a time when the United States was experiencing an unprecedented economic boom, a bonanza that seemed unstoppable. City streets were full of Ford automobiles that represented technological advancement and the feeling that the future would be bright. In almost every home, a radio was on, connecting millions of people with music, news, and entertainment that until a few years before were unthinkable. Jazz clubs were always packed, vibrating with a musical style that symbolized freedom, innovation, and a youthful spirit that spread across the country. At the same time, skyscrapers began to rise to the heavens, one after another, as if each building was trying to prove that limits had been left behind. The general atmosphere was one of total euphoria. Most believed that prosperity would last forever and that nothing could interrupt that frantic pace of growth. However, in the midst of this scenario of money and optimism, a man emerged whose influence would transform this dream into a nightmare for millions. This man was Charles Edwin Mitchell. Mitchell was born in 1877 in Massachusetts into a family of farmers who led a simple life marked by hard work. Nothing in his early years indicated that he would become a key figure in the financial system. He was the son of a humble man, and yet from a young age he showed intense ambition, a determination that would take him much further than anyone would have imagined. Over time, this ambition pushed him to make his way in the banking world, and in 1919 he reached the top by taking over the direction of the National City Bank, which at that moment was the largest bank in the entire country. The institution controlled assets of $2.7 billion, a figure so gigantic that it surpassed the budget of most countries in the world at that time. This gave him immense power, a power that few people in history had held in their hands. But Mitchell did not want to settle for running a giant bank. He had a completely new idea, a vision that no one else dared to. Consider an idea that promised to open the doors to explosive growth and that in time would unleash the most devastating consequences of the century. This revolutionary idea would be the point where everything changed. Before Mitchell's arrival in the financial world, shares were practically an exclusive toy of the country's richest men. They were instruments reserved for an elite that moved large sums of money and had access to privileged information. Only 500,000 Americans, a number representing less than 1% of the entire population, owned shares. For the common citizen, the stock market was something distant, almost mysterious, and completely out of reach. Most people entrusted their financial stability to traditional banks. They kept their savings in simple accounts or bought government-issued bonds, seeking security above any dream of wealth. The stock market functioned like a closed club, a space where only those with a surname, fortune, or connections entered, and for decades this dynamic remained intact. But Mitchell looked at this panorama from another perspective. While others saw a system reserved for a few, he saw a space full of unexplored opportunities. For him, the idea that only the richest could participate in the creation of wealth was a monumental waste. "Every American should be a capitalist," he once said, and with that phrase he made his vision clear. He wondered why wealth should be concentrated only in the hands of a minority, when millions of people could participate and benefit from the country's economic growth. His thinking was simple but powerful. If more citizens invested, more money would flow into companies, and this would further boost the economy. This is how, in 1920, Mitchell created a subsidiary called National City Company. Its purpose was direct and ambitious: to bring shares to the people. The idea was to offer investment opportunities within the bank branches themselves, a place where any citizen felt safe and familiar. When a person went to the bank to open a savings account, employees already had precise instructions. They told that person about the chance to invest in the American dream, to become the owner of a small part of the companies that moved the country. Many heard for the first time that they could be shareholders, that they could participate in the wealth that until that moment was only reserved for the elite. This was the beginning of a silent revolution, a revolution that would transform the relationship between citizens and the markets and ignite the spark of something much bigger. Mitchell transformed the sale of shares into a true art. He understood something that very few bankers of his time dared to study: human psychology. He analyzed every detail of how people thought, what their fears were, what they desired for their families, and what kind of dreams could move them to act. He knew human greed, but he also knew the hope of millions of ordinary Americans who sought a chance to improve their lives. His plans were so meticulous that he trained his salespeople with a special program he designed himself, a program that mixed persuasion, marketing, and a deep understanding of what motivated people. These salespeople were strategically distributed in 69 bank branches across the country. And they were not the typical serious bankers who spoke finance speak. They were charismatic representatives, experts in presenting the idea of investing as a path to prosperity. They were merchants of dreams. The advertising Mitchell used was also revolutionary for its time. Newspapers began to show catchy advertisements offering the common citizen the chance to become an investor with just a monthly amount. Advertisements that said things like, "Become a partner of American Telephone and Telegraph. Your children will be proud. You are an investor." This type of message touched people's hearts directly. It spoke of status, future, family. Magazines published stories that seemed to have come out of an inspiring movie. They presented success stories like how an Ohio secretary got rich in 2 years, or the story of the streetcar conductor who managed to buy his own home thanks to the dividends he received. These stories, real or exaggerated, showed that anyone could get ahead in life, that any citizen could own a part of the most powerful country in the world. The salespeople, in turn, used phrases that connected with the deepest aspirations of the clients. A representative could approach an ordinary man and say, "Mr. Johnson, you desire something more than working for someone else your whole life. General Electric shares. This is your chance to become the owner of your own destiny." With this phrase, they touched a sensitive point, the desire for freedom. For women, they also spoke with emotional precision. They said, "Mrs. Smith, your husband works for Ford. Why not also become a co-owner of the company?" This suggestion made the investment seem natural, familiar, symbolic, as if participating in the company where the husband worked was an act of union and joint growth. The offices of the National City Company completed the experience. They were decorated with large and colorful posters showing smiling families in front of enormous houses with shiny cars and perfect gardens. On many of these posters, one could read, "Thanks to stocks, we bought the house of our dreams." Every image conveyed the same idea: prosperity, well-being, and a shielded future. Happy faces, children playing, expensive cars. Everything built to awaken in clients the feeling that such a life was within reach. Every element of the system was calculated to lead the average citizen to believe that investing was the definitive path to a better life. But the true genius of the system created by Mitchell lay in the credit scheme he promoted like no one before. He understood that if he wanted millions of citizens to enter the stock market, he had to offer a tool that would multiply their economic power. And that's what he did. Shares could be bought using margin. The client put in only 10% of his money, and the bank lent the rest. This opened a giant door for those who had never had access to large-scale investments. To understand it clearly, think of it simply. If a person had $100, they could acquire $1,000 in shares using the margin that banks offered. And if the value of these shares rose 20%, that person had a profit of $200, which meant having doubled the initial money with a risk that seemed minuscule. This feeling of financial power seduced anyone. The salespeople explained this mechanics with very easy-to-understand examples. They said things like that Mr. Brown bought Radio Corporation shares for $500, putting in only $50. In 6 months, these shares grew $150. His profit was 300%. And if this money had been sitting in a bank account, it would have only yielded $1. This type of comparison made any client feel almost obligated to participate. The difference was so brutal that it seemed an impossible opportunity to ignore. The impact was immediate and enormous. Between 1925 and 1929, the volume of loans used to buy shares skyrocketed. It went from $2,000 million to $8,500 million, which represented an increase of 425% in just 4 years. Never before had such accelerated growth in credit for investments been seen. At the same time, the number of Americans who owned shares grew from 500,000 to 10 million people. With this massive expansion, all kinds of citizens began to participate in the financial fever. An Ohio teacher mortgaged her house to buy Radio Corporation shares, convinced that this investment was the passport to a better life. A Kansas farmer decided to sell his cattle to buy General Motors shares, hoping that the automotive industry would lead him to prosperity. And a Detroit mechanic allocated 6 months of accumulated salary into Ford shares, in the hope of escaping a life of hard work without rewards. All of them were convinced that it was their moment, that they finally had access to a tool that before was only in the hands of the rich. They felt that the real possibility of getting rich was opening up before them. Meanwhile, Mitchell received praise from all sides. He was seen as a visionary, as the man who democratized the market and brought a new era of prosperity to millions. What these citizens did not know was that that same expansion, so celebrated, was creating the storm that would soon destroy everything. Mitchell was celebrated throughout the country as a true financial genius, a pioneer capable of transforming the market and opening the doors of Wall Street to millions of citizens. For many, he was an almost mythical figure. In 1928, he earned $200,000, a sum that, translated into current values, would be equivalent to about $20 million. Magazines portrayed him as the guy who had transformed every American into a potential millionaire. His face appeared on covers, accompanied by headlines describing him as the architect of a new era of popular wealth. However, his ambition led him even further. Mitchell decided to create investment trust funds, special funds that bought shares using borrowed money. These funds not only invested, but became corporations whose own securities were also bought again using credit. This created an extremely fragile system, a gigantic structure built with levels of debt that depended on stock prices continuing to rise without stopping. In essence, it was a financial pyramid based on the blind faith that the market would continue to rise eternally. Each layer of debt supported the previous one, and millions of citizens invested without understanding that they were entering a terrain where any sudden movement could bring everything down. In the spring of 1929, even the most optimistic economist began to become restless. Many observed that stock prices were growing at a much higher rate than the real economy. The country produced, consumed, and advanced, but the market was rising to a level that no longer had solid backing. The Federal Reserve System itself lit up the red alert. The market was dangerously overheating. The numbers spoke for themselves. The shares of the country's most important companies were being traded at prices that represented 15 times their annual profits. This ratio, which today is considered one of the clearest indicators of a speculative bubble, already generated concern among analysts of that time. It was an evident sign that something was out of control. On February 6, 1929, the Federal Reserve System issued a formal warning addressed to banks. The instruction was clear. They should stop loans intended for speculation in the stock market. The central bank demanded to immediately limit the granting of margin loans because it understood that the artificial growth created by debt could trigger a violent fall. The market's reaction was immediate and forceful. In March, shares began to fall. In a few days, Americans lost billions of dollars. Each trading day seemed more tense than the previous one, and panic began to spread. Many believed that the definitive burst had arrived. The bubble seemed to have reached its limit. What no one knew was that the worst was yet to come. And then, on March 12, 1929, Charles Mitchell made a decision that would forever change the course of financial history. He summoned journalists, gathered industry leaders, and in front of the cameras uttered words that would be forever engraved in the country's economic archives, declaring with absolute certainty, "The National City Bank will provide the market with all the necessary liquidity. We will not allow an unnecessary crisis to occur. This phrase traveled across the country with impressive speed. In a matter of hours, newspapers were already emblazoned with huge headlines saying, "Charlie, the Radiant, saves the market." For millions of citizens, Mitchell became a kind of modern hero, the man who had stopped a crisis right on the edge of the abyss. Shares recovered strongly, and in just 1 week, the market not only recovered all recent losses, but reached levels never before seen. It was as if the entire nation had received an injection of confidence that fueled a new speculative impulse. After this declaration, the market entered the final phase of the frenzy. During the summer of 1929, shares reached historical highs that seemed impossible to surpass. The Dow Jones Index reached 381 points, a record so high that it would take 25 years to be broken. For many, this number symbolized the absolute triumph of capitalism of the era. In these final months, 3 million new citizens threw themselves into the stock market with an almost religious faith. Every day, new stories appeared about ordinary people who had transformed their lives thanks to shares. Many wives secretly pawned their jewelry to raise the money needed to invest. In the streets, even shoe shiners gave investment tips to clients while polishing their shoes. And even children spent the money they earned from their parents, buying small packages of shares that they hoped to see grow. Those who had entered the market earlier felt like true financial prodigies. Office workers found themselves millionaires on paper. Drivers who once dreamed of owning their own car now dared to buy mansions. Secretaries who had spent years saving for an elegant dress appeared wearing fur coats. The entire country lived intoxicated by the illusion of endless wealth, as if money could multiply forever without consequences. However, behind this brilliant facade lay the mathematics that would shape a catastrophe. Every dollar invested in shares was backed by only 10 cents of real money. This meant that a 10% drop in prices left the margin investor completely ruined, and a 50% drop left him indebted to the bank for an amount greater than everything he could earn in a whole year. The structure was so fragile that a small tremor was enough to bring down the entire system. The nation celebrated, but in silence, the disaster was already underway. In the autumn of 1929, what was known as smart money began to become restless. Large institutional investors, the oldest pension funds, insurance companies and banks that controlled fortunes of entire generations, observed signs that ordinary people overlooked. These were subtle signs, but enough to alert those who understood the deep functioning of the economy. The first sign was the deterioration of economic indicators. Industrial production began to slow down after years of uninterrupted growth. Factories worked fewer hours, orders decreased, and many entrepreneurs began to worry. Automobile sales also fell, an especially alarming fact because the car had become the symbol of the decade's prosperity. New home construction decreased across the country, something that always indicates a loss of confidence in the future. Despite all this, shares continued to rise without stopping. The market continued an irrational escalation, completely disconnected from the real economy. For experts, the distance between the value of companies and their true yield was becoming a critical abyss, a hole that sooner or later would demand its toll. The second alarm signal had to do with the market structure. Experienced investors knew better than anyone the mathematics of margin trading. They knew that when 90% of the money circulating in the market came from loans, the situation was extremely fragile. In such a system, any fall, even a small one, had the power to become a large-scale disaster. What for most seemed like a chance to get rich quickly, for those who understood the mechanism, it was a time bomb. Joseph Kennedy, father of the future President of the United States, would recount years later a famous anecdote. He said, "When the shoe shiner started giving me stock tips, I knew it was time to sell." This phrase perfectly summarized the market environment. When even those without financial knowledge began to confidently opine on complex investments, experts knew that the speculative cycle was in its final stage. The third sign was linked to the Federal Reserve System. The most influential investors had information about the central bank's plans. They knew that an interest rate hike was being prepared, and such an increase would make margin loans more expensive, which could provoke a wave of massive sales among those who depended on credit to maintain their positions. For experts, this measure was a direct blow to the heart of the speculative market. Faced with all these signs, the big players began to move their chips very carefully. They sold in small quantities day after day so as not to cause a sudden collapse that would drag everyone down prematurely. The goal was to exit the bubble without attracting attention, but by October the situation could no longer be held. Patience had run out, and at that point history was one step away from its most brutal fall. On the morning of October 24, 1929, the largest investment funds in New York made a decision that had been quietly anticipated for weeks. It was a coordinated, cold, and calculated decision. It's time to get out. Early on, they began to divest their positions and sell enormous blocks of shares, hundreds of thousands of securities at the same time. At first, the drop in prices was slow, almost imperceptible to the common citizen. But those who knew market behavior understood that this initial movement was the beginning of something serious. And in a matter of minutes, the fall became an avalanche. The numbers on the boards began to turn red, and the quotes that had risen for years began to crumble as if an invisible thread had broken. By midday, panic had taken total control. In a single day, 13 million shares were sold, 5 times more than usually moved in a typical day. Brokers ran back and forth with piles of orders they couldn't process in time. Telephones rang non-stop, but the system simply couldn't handle the volume of calls. Lines saturated, messages didn't get through, and the stock exchange seemed to be entering a state of total chaos. At that instant, the domino effect that Mitchell had unknowingly built began to be activated. The system he had enthusiastically promoted, based on the massive use of margin loans, had created a structure completely vulnerable to any sharp drop. And that day, the first piece fell. First domino piece, the fall in prices forced banks to demand additional contributions from all investors who had bought shares on margin. Banks needed to protect themselves, and according to the rules of the system, when the value of shares fell, clients had to put in more money to maintain their positions. Second domino piece, most of these investors did not have enough money to cover the bank's demands. Faced with this lack of resources, they were forced to sell their shares to cover payments. This wave of sales only served to further accelerate the plunge in prices. Third domino piece, as prices continued to collapse, shares ceased to be acceptable collateral for new loans. They could no longer back new credit, and when securities lose value as collateral, banks retreat. This withdrawal immediately cut off the supply of liquidity that kept the entire speculative system functioning. Fourth domino piece, banks that had issued too many margin loans began to fail. It was precisely the institutions that followed Mitchell's example that were the first to fall. They had given unlimited credit, trusting that the market would rise forever. And now, with shares plummeting, these loans turned into unpayable debts. In a matter of hours, the world's most powerful financial market had entered its most devastating fall. Everything had started with a few sell orders, but the forces that were unleashed afterward escaped anyone's control. October 29th, Black Tuesday. This day was etched as the final collapse of the market, and the moment when the illusion of wealth that had enveloped millions of people turned into ruins. In a single day, Americans lost $14,000 million, an amount greater than everything the country had spent during the First World War. The economic blow was so immense that it left scars that would take decades to heal. But behind these cold figures were human tragedies that spread throughout the country. Edward Hopkins, a Detroit mechanic, was one of those millions of citizens. He had bought Ford shares for $5,000, his entire life savings. In November, the value of those shares fell to $200. The bank, following margin rules, demanded an additional $3,000 to maintain his position. Having no way to get this amount and feeling that everything he had built was crumbling, Hopkins made a tragic decision. He hanged himself in his own garage. His story was one of thousands of silent accounts that emerged after the fall. Another life marked by tragedy was that of Mary Sheffield, an Ohio teacher. She mortgaged her parents' house to buy Radio Corporation shares, convinced that it was the best chance to secure a future for her family. After the collapse, the bank took the property. That house, which had been home to 3 generations, remained in the hands of the financial institution. The family found themselves on the street overnight, without a roof and without the security they had built for decades. In New York, the lines that formed were not only at banks, but also on bridges and sidewalks near the river. Suicides reached levels never before seen. The Brooklyn Bridge became a symbol of national despair. There, people who just a few months before considered themselves millionaires on paper ended their lives. People who had believed they were living the most prosperous time of their lives. The fall was so abrupt that many did not find the strength to continue. And what happened to Charles Mitchell, the man who had promoted the system that led millions to such deep ruin? In 1933, he was summoned to testify before Congress. During the hearing, Senator Carter Glass asked a direct and devastating question. Do you consider yourself responsible for the ruin of millions of American families? The room fell silent, awaiting the answer. Mitchell replied, I wanted to give people the chance to get rich. No one forced them to buy shares. His words left a bitter taste. For many, it sounded like an evasion, like the voice of a man who did not acknowledge the extent of the damage he helped cause. But history did not absolve him. In that same year, 1933, Mitchell was tried for tax evasion in the amount of $850,000. It was a fatal blow to his reputation. He was forced to resign from his position and fell into total disgrace. The man who in the previous decade had been called the savior of the market and the architect of prosperity became a symbol of greed, irresponsibility, and excess. His fall reflected the fate of an entire era, an era where ambition had surpassed the limits of reason and where the illusion of wealth ended up leaving a deep wound in millions of lives. American society was deeply divided in its attitude towards Charles Mitchell. While some voices defended him, others attacked him with relentless harshness. Newspapers reflected this polarization. The New York Times described him as the architect of the financial catastrophe and as the man who turned the American dream into a real nightmare for millions. For a large part of the public, Mitchell was the personification of exaggeration, recklessness, and immoderate ambition. Among ordinary Americans, resentment was immense. Many had lost their homes, their savings, their jobs, and felt that Mitchell had played a fundamental role in their misfortune. In the streets of New York, when his name was mentioned, boos were heard. A Detroit newspaper published a phrase that captured the people's feeling of indignation. Charles Mitchell stole more from us than any bank robber in history. A thief takes a bag of money, but Mitchell took the future of an entire generation. This type of statement showed the intensity of collective pain, but at the same time, defenders emerged who saw the situation from another angle. Many entrepreneurs claimed that Mitchell had not forced anyone to invest. They insisted that people chose greed instead of prudence, that millions of citizens let themselves be carried away by the illusion of making money quickly. His former banking colleagues also offered their perspective. For them, Charlie had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. According to this view, any banker in his position would have acted similarly because the entire system was built to advance without brakes towards speculation. As for the National City Bank, the paradox was surprising. Although Mitchell fell into disgrace, the bank not only survived the crisis, but emerged strengthened. After his resignation, the new management took quick and forceful measures, closed all operations considered risky, and focused its efforts on conservative activities such as deposits and traditional loans. In addition, the bank received government support for being considered too big to fail, an expression that was beginning to take shape at that time. The collapse of many competitors also played in favor of the National City Bank. Smaller institutions did not withstand the impact of the crisis and were absorbed by the financial giant at ridiculously low prices. By 1935, the bank controlled a larger share of the market than it had before the collapse. In terms of financial power, the institution emerged from the Great Depression more robust than ever. Mitchell, on the other hand, lived a completely different fate. After the trial, he moved to Europe, where he worked as a consultant for small banks seeking financial guidance. This stage marked a complete departure from the prominence he had in the previous decade. He later returned to the United States in the 1940s, and founded a modest investment firm, very different from the financial empire he had run in his youth. Charlie the Radiant transformed into an elderly man who lived his last years under a long and heavy shadow. For most, his name remained associated with the greed, imprudence, and excesses that characterized the 1920s. His figure no longer inspired admiration, but a mixture of warning and distrust, as if his story were a reminder of how misdirected ambition can destroy everything in its path. Mitchell died in 1955 at the age of 78, never acknowledging his responsibility in what many consider the worst economic tragedy of the 20th century. His legacy was forever marked by this denial and the weight of a history that surpassed him. The catastrophe unleashed by Mitchell not only broke fortunes and destroyed lives, but also forever transformed the American financial system. The magnitude of the disaster revealed deep flaws in the functioning of markets and in the way banks were allowed to operate. In 1933, Congress approved one of the most important laws in the country's economic history, the Glass-Steagall Act. This law completely separated the activities of commercial banks and investment banks. The purpose was clear and direct: to prevent bankers from again risking depositors' money by speculating with it on Wall Street. Along with this reform, the Securities Commission, SEC, was created, an entity responsible for supervising and regulating the stock market more strictly. This put an end to decades of obscure practices and allowed for stricter rules to protect investors. Deposit insurance was also introduced, a crucial measure to restore public confidence after the thousands of banks that had failed during the crisis. In addition, severe requirements were applied to margin trading in order to prevent uncontrolled credit from inflating speculative bubbles. Again, the United States made a national oath: something like this should never happen again. However, the government also took measures that were even more radical. In April 1933, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed an executive order that shook the foundations of the American monetary system. This order prohibited citizens from owning gold. All Americans, without exception, had to hand over their gold coins, ingots, and bars to the government for a fixed price determined by the state. This decision was a desperate attempt to regain control of the monetary system. As long as the population had the right to exchange dollars for gold, the government could not increase the amount of money in circulation to combat deflation and stimulate the economy. The confiscation of gold allowed for an increase in the money supply and reduced the deflationary pressure that was suffocating the country. But this relief came at a very high cost. The state violated one of the most deeply rooted rights in American culture, the freedom to own precious metals. In just 1 month, citizens handed over more than 3,600 tons of gold, an amount greater than the combined current reserves of Russia and China. And a year later, the government raised the official price of gold from $20 to $35 per ounce, which generated billions of dollars in profit for the state, thanks to the metal that had been confiscated. The scars of the Great Depression extended for generations. The American economy took 10 full years to recover. Millions of people forever lost confidence in the stock market. Those who had believed in the promise of easy wealth now feared any type of investment. An entire generation developed the habit of keeping money under the mattress, inside hidden cans, or in small personal deposits, preferring absolute security rather than trusting again in banks and markets that had failed so profoundly. The Great Depression left visible and invisible wounds, and its shadow stretched for decades over every home in the country. Today, almost a century after the 1929 collapse, history advances with an unsettling similarity. Close to 50 million Americans trade shares in the palm of their hand using smartphones that allow them to operate with an ease unimaginable for any investor of the last century. The volume of margin loans reached a record figure of $900,000 million, an explosion of speculative credit that precisely recalls the excesses prior to Black Tuesday. Modern investment applications, especially platforms like Robinhood, repeat almost word for word the same promises that Mitchell offered at the beginning of the 20th century. Messages like, make everyone an investor, zero commissions, trade like a professional, and invest your salary feed the aspirations of millions of people who seek a quick path to wealth. The idea is the same. Open the doors of the market to everyone without warning that democratizing access without democratizing financial education can become a double-edged sword. A new generation enthusiastically throws itself into cryptocurrencies, meme stocks, and the world's most volatile markets, often using borrowed money through margin accounts. The promises are identical to those of the 1920s: rapid enrichment, cheap loans, and the feeling that a historic opportunity is being lived. The mechanism created by Mitchell almost 100 years ago is now replicated on digital screens with larger figures and more complex risks. Meanwhile, the average citizen finds himself in a worrying situation. Today, he owes more than he earns in an entire year. Consumer debts accumulate, credits multiply, and margin trading reaches levels comparable to those of 1929. And yet millions of people are convinced that this time will be different, that technology, modernity, and market speed have eliminated the risk that destroyed fortunes in the past. The story of Charles Mitchell is a warning that continues to be valid. His original intention was sincere: to give ordinary people the chance to participate in the country's economic growth. He believed he could open the doors of wealth to everyone. However, his system ended up transforming the American dream into a nightmare for a quarter of the population. His ideas, which seemed noble, ended up unbalancing the market and unleashing the greatest economic tragedy of the 20th century. In 1928, Mitchell proudly declared every American should be a capitalist. Today, almost identical words are heard: everyone should invest. The rhetoric changes clothes, but the message remains the same. History does not go in circles, but it rhymes, and it does so with surprising precision. The next time you hear promises of easy money, offers to democratize finance, or invitations to invest without analyzing the risk, remember Charlie, the Radiant. Remember what happened when millions of people followed a promise without understanding the hidden cost. And always ask yourself, who is really going to win? And in the end, when you observe this entire journey spanning almost a century, you discover something essential. Crises do not arise from nothing. They arise from decisions, from excesses, from illusions, and, above all, from the way each generation interprets wealth. Charles Mitchell left a deep mark on history, not for his intention, but for the consequences he never foresaw. His legacy continues to remind us that when money promises easy paths, there is always a hidden price waiting to be paid. If there is anything we can learn from all this, it is that history never stops talking to us. It shows you patterns, teaches you warnings, and offers you a clarity that often the emotion of the moment does not let you see. The question is whether you will be willing to listen before it is too late. Thank you for accompanying me to the end of this analysis. If this content helped you better understand how the financial cycle works and why these stories matter so much today, I invite you to support the channel. Subscribe to receive more videos like this. Share this documentary with someone it might serve, and leave a comment to know which part of the story impacted you the most. Thank you for watching this video. Your support makes it possible for us to continue creating deep, useful, and necessary content to understand the world we live in. See you in the next chapter.